Before dawn broke over Greystone Air Base, 50 engineers stood helpless around a classified jet that sat 10 minutes before a do-or-die demonstration. General Samuel Grant declared coldly that no civilian would ever touch that aircraft. Mason, a quiet single father in a worn jacket, said nothing. He simply set his tool bag down. Laughter rippled through the hangar, mocking him, certain he belonged nowhere near machines like this. Then he opened a sealed military file nobody in that room was supposed to see again. The name on the first page made every officer turn pale in stunned, suffocating silence. Stay until the very end, because the secret inside Mason's file is about to turn this entire base upside down. At 4:17 in the morning, Greystone Air Base sat under a sky still bruised with night, the kind of cold that crept through every open hangar door and refused to leave. Floodlights burned white across the tarmac, throwing long shadows of soldiers who moved fast and said little, because everyone on that base already understood what today meant. In a handful of hours, a delegation from the Department of Defense would arrive to watch a single demonstration that would decide the future of an entire program. There was no room for delay, no room for excuse, and certainly no room for failure. The tension in the air was almost physical, pressing down on every shoulder that crossed the tarmac that morning. At the center of the main hangar sat the jet nobody outside that base was allowed to name aloud, a classified prototype known only by its internal designation, the X-47. Its frame caught the overhead lights in cold, metallic flashes, and around it stood layer after layer of security, checkpoints, badges, retinal scanners, and armed guards who rarely blinked. The aircraft represented an investment worth billions, a leap forward in flight control technology that the entire base had staked its reputation on. If the demonstration failed in front of the Department of Defense, the consequences would not stop at embarrassment. Contracts would collapse, careers would end, and the base itself might lose the very program it had built around this single machine. 50 engineers and contractors had worked through the entire night without rest, running diagnostics, swapping components, rewriting code, and still the jet refused to wake up. Logan Pierce, the lead engineer, stood at the center of that chaos, trying to hold on to a calm he did not feel, his eyes fixed on a wall of error data that refused to make sense. He had built his career on being the man who always had an answer, and for the first time in years he had none. Around him, junior engineers exchanged nervous glances, afraid to be the one who said the obvious thing out loud. The clock on the wall kept moving forward, indifferent to all of it. General Samuel Grant walked into the hangar like weather arriving, his presence enough to straighten every spine in the room. His voice, when it came, was flat and cold, demanding a full report within 60 seconds, no excuses attached. Logan tried to explain that every system checked out perfectly on paper, yet the jet kept locking itself down the instant it approached flight mode, as though something deeper than a wiring fault was at work. Samuel's jaw tightened, because in a few short hours the demonstration would happen whether the jet was ready or not, and failure was not a word he allowed himself to consider. He asked Logan, point blank, whether this was incompetence or something worse. Amelia Hayes, the base's technical security specialist, stepped forward with a tablet in hand, her voice steady even as the room around her grew louder. She reported irregular activity buried inside the secondary control sequence, patterns that did not match standard wear or normal system drift. She was careful with her words, choosing not to say the term sabotage out loud, because she did not yet have proof strong enough to justify it. Samuel did not want to hear that word regardless, because admitting sabotage meant admitting his base had already been breached from within. He ordered her to keep digging quietly, away from outside ears, while the engineers kept working the surface problem. A young soldier near the hangar entrance hesitated before speaking, then mentioned that a civilian mechanic from outside the gate, a man named Mason Carter, had once been called in to fix a hydraulic issue on a support vehicle months earlier and had a reputation for unusual precision. Samuel's reaction was immediate and sharp, calling the suggestion an insult to everything the uniform stood for, insisting that no outsider belonged anywhere near a machine this sensitive. Still, with the clock running out and every internal solution exhausted, even Samuel's certainty had a crack forming inside it. He turned back to the failing jet, jaw clenched, refusing to admit that he had nowhere else left to turn. In the distance, past the checkpoint gate, a man in a worn mechanic's jacket walked through security with a battered tool bag slung over one shoulder, utterly out of place among the rigid uniforms and polished boots around him. He moved without hurry, without nervousness, simply observing the base the way a man might study a street he had once known well and had not walked in years. Soldiers glanced at him sideways. unsure why a civilian had been allowed this close to the most secure hangar on the property. He did not look at any of them. His eyes were already fixed on the hangar doors ahead, as though something inside was calling him back. Mason was escorted into the hangar under a wave of stares that ranged from confusion to open contempt. Soldiers and engineers alike, unsure why, a stranger in worn coveralls had been allowed past the outer checkpoints. Logan was the first to speak, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he asked whether the new arrival planned to fix a billion-dollar prototype with a garage wrench and a prayer. Mason said nothing in response. He simply looked at the X-47 the way someone looks at a face they have not seen in years but would recognize anywhere, instantly, without hesitation. The recognition in his eyes lasted only a second, but it was enough for anyone paying close attention to notice that something about this man did not fit the joke being made at his expense. Samuel crossed the floor quickly and placed himself directly between Mason and the painted red safety line that bordered the aircraft, his posture rigid, his expression carved from stone. He delivered the line that would echo through that hangar for the rest of the day, stating plainly that no civilian would ever be allowed to touch that jet. The words landed hard, and for a moment the room went silent, before a scattering of quiet laughter broke out among a few of the younger engineers standing near the back wall. Mason did not flinch, did not argue, and did not retreat a single step. Instead, he asked one simple question, wanting to know at exactly what second after activation the system had locked itself down. Logan's irritation flared because the question was far too specific for a man who supposedly fixed trucks for a living. He answered anyway, almost reflexively, stating that the lockdown occurred at 11.6 seconds after ignition. Mason absorbed the number without surprise and asked a second question just as precise, wanting to know whether the vibration in the airframe appeared before or after the secondary valve opened. Amelia's head turned sharply toward him at that, because this was not the kind of detail a mechanic would think to ask about, let alone phrase correctly using internal terminology that was never shared outside the program. Logan tried to wave it off, suggesting that Mason had simply gotten lucky with a guest dressed up in technical language. Samuel, his patience thinning by the second, ordered Mason to step back from the sensitive area immediately, unwilling to let this distraction continue while the clock kept running. Mason reached into his jacket and produced an old military envelope, its red wax seal faded and cracked with age, though he did not hand it over right away. Instead, he spoke calmly, warning that if they attempted another ignition sequence without first checking the tertiary feedback line, the control core itself could catch fire and be lost entirely. Logan laughed out loud at that, reminding everyone that 50 trained engineers had already checked every single system twice over the course of the night. Mason looked past him, directly at Samuel, and said that 50 people could share the exact same blind spot if the blueprint they were all trusting was not the true final version. The hangar fell into a silence heavier than before, the kind that settles when a sentence lands somewhere it was not expected to reach. Engineers exchanged uncertain glances, some annoyed, some suddenly less sure of themselves than they had been a minute earlier. Amelia stepped slightly closer to Mason, studying him now with open curiosity rather than suspicion, while Logan's jaw tightened in a way that suggested the remark had cut closer than he wanted to admit. Samuel's eyes dropped briefly to the sealed envelope still resting in Mason's hand, and something in his expression shifted, the certainty that had carried him through the night beginning to waver for the first time. He did not order Mason removed. He simply stood there, watching the envelope, the first flicker of doubt crossing a face built for command. Samuel still did not trust the man standing in front of him, but the pressure of a deadline that refused to wait left him little choice. He allowed Mason to remain outside the safety line, permitted to speak but forbidden to touch anything, a compromise that satisfied no one fully but bought a little more time. Logan saw an opportunity in that arrangement and seized it eagerly, deciding that the fastest way to dismiss this stranger was to humiliate him in front of the entire hangar. He challenged Mason to predict exactly what would go wrong if they attempted the ignition sequence one more time, his tone dripping with theatrical confidence as he gestured toward the assembled crowd of engineers and officers. Mason studied the data moving across the nearest monitor, listened carefully to the low hum of the secondary fan system, and watched the faint tremor running along the tail section of the aircraft. After a long pause, he stated that the system would lock at 11.6 seconds just as before, but that 2 seconds prior to that, a secondary warning light labeled C9 would blink exactly twice. Logan let out a short, dismissive laugh, pointing out that the control panel had never once flagged anything resembling a C9 warning during the entire night of testing. Samuel, more out of impatience than belief, authorized one more attempt in a restricted safety mode, if only to put an end to the argument quickly. Every eye in the hangar fixed on the digital countdown as the ignition sequence began, the low whine of internal systems rising steadily through the cold air. At the 9-second mark, the C9 light blinked once, faint but unmistakable against the dim glow of the instrument panel. A second blink followed almost immediately after, drawing a sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the back of the crowd. Then, exactly as Mason had said, the entire system locked itself down at 11.6 seconds, the same failure as before, occurring at the precise moment he had named in advance. The atmosphere inside that hangar shifted instantly, disbelief rippling through engineers who had spent the entire night failing to predict anything with that kind of accuracy. Logan recovered quickly, insisting loudly that Mason must have somehow accessed restricted data beforehand, perhaps glancing at a screen he should never have seen. Amelia stepped in before the accusation could gain traction, pointing out calmly that the C9 data point never appeared on any publicly visible report, meaning only someone who understood the deeper architecture of the system could have predicted it. Samuel's expression hardened further, though now the hardness was aimed less at Mason and more at the questions multiplying rapidly inside his own mind. He asked in a tone far less commanding than before exactly where Mason had worked previously in his career. Mason answered vaguely, mentioning only that he had once been part of an experimental flight maintenance program, offering nothing more specific than that. Logan tried once more to regain control of the room, insisting that no civilian could ever have legitimate access to a prototype of this classification level. Mason replied quietly that the prototype was not entirely new, that it had been built upon an older foundation that very few people currently inside that hangar were even aware existed. Near the far wall, Hunter Blake, the defense contractor overseeing the base's newest upgrade package, shifted uncomfortably for the first time, his polished composure cracking just slightly at the edges. Amelia noticed him reaching for his phone and typing something with unusual urgency, a detail she filed away without remark. Mason, ignoring all of it, crouched beneath the aircraft and asked for a particular sensor cluster to be inspected, one that, according to him, was never listed anywhere on the current blueprint. Logan insisted flatly that no such cluster existed, his voice rising slightly with frustration. Mason pointed to a precise location along the underside of the fuselage, his fingers steady, his certainty unshaken by the rising tension around him. When a technician finally pried open the panel cover at that exact spot, a small auxiliary sensor cluster sat there, hidden and unaccounted for in every document the engineering team had been using all night. The entire group of engineers fell into stunned silence, the kind that comes only when certainty collapses all at once. Samuel turned slowly toward Mason, his voice dropping lower than anyone had heard it all night, and asked who he truly was. Mason did not answer the question directly. Instead, he held out the sealed envelope toward Samuel, letting the weight of the moment speak for itself rather than filling the silence with words. Samuel studied the faded wax seal and recognized immediately that this was no ordinary civilian paperwork, but something that belonged to a much deeper layer of military record-keeping. He ordered everyone else to step back, allowing only Amelia to remain close, since her role in technical security gave her clearance that most of the others in the room did not share. With careful hands, Samuel broke the seal and opened the file, the hangar around him holding its breath as though sensing that everything was about to change. The first line inside identified the subject as Mason Carter. The second line listed a former title that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat, naming him as a special test flight engineer attached to a program known only as Shadow Wing. Samuel's color drained slightly because Shadow Wing was a name he had only ever heard whispered among senior officers, treated more like rumor than recorded history. Amelia read further down the page and discovered that Mason had once personally prevented an experimental aircraft from crashing during a live test flight, an act that had apparently been buried rather than celebrated. Logan, still unwilling to accept what he was seeing, suggested loudly that the document could easily be fabricated, a forgery designed to manipulate the room. Samuel, unwilling to leave the matter to guesswork, immediately contacted Joseph Miller, the classified records officer responsible for verifying files exactly like this one. While waiting for confirmation to come through, Mason remained near the jet, watching it with quiet focus, showing no trace of pride or self-satisfaction at the sudden reversal taking place around him. At one point, his phone buzzed gently inside his jacket pocket, and a brief glance revealed a photo of his daughter Lisa tucked behind his identification card, though he chose not to answer given how urgent the situation around him had become. The detail was small, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, yet it quietly reminded the room that this man carried responsibilities far beyond the walls of that hangar. Amelia noticed the photograph as well, and in that instant she understood something important about the man standing before her, that he was not chasing recognition or glory, only doing what needed to be done. Joseph's voice finally came through the secure line, confirming without hesitation that the file was authentic in every detail. He added, with a weight that settled heavily over the room, that Mason had been forced out of the Shadow Wing program after exposing a design flaw that certain people in power had worked very hard to keep hidden. The hangar fell utterly silent at that revelation, the kind of silence that follows when an old, comfortable story suddenly reveals itself to be a lie. Samuel realized with a creeping sense of dread that the man he had humiliated only minutes earlier might be the only person in that entire building who truly understood the soul of this aircraft. Logan's confidence cracked visibly, his mind already racing toward the realization that his position within the program might now be in serious jeopardy. Hunter Blake, who had been watching from the edge of the gathered crowd, quietly slipped away toward the far end of the hangar without drawing attention to himself. Mason, breaking the tense silence, stated calmly that the current malfunction was not a natural mechanical failure at all. He explained that someone had deliberately inserted a false lockout sequence designed specifically to sabotage today's demonstration before it could even begin. Before anyone could respond to that claim, a security alarm suddenly blared across the hangar, warning that an unauthorized access attempt had just been detected on the base's maintenance servers, the timing too precise to be coincidence. Amelia moved instantly to the nearest terminal, pulling up the access logs with practiced speed despite the alarm still echoing through the hangar. The records showed that a maintenance account had logged in at 2:13 in the morning, just minutes before the system had begun behaving erratically. Logan insisted this had to be coincidence, that the timing meant nothing beyond an unfortunate overlap with a routine scheduled check. Mason asked a question that cut straight through the noise, wanting to know who exactly stood to benefit if this demonstration failed in front of the Department of Defense. Samuel's gaze drifted slowly toward the contractor's side of the room, landing on Hunter Blake, the man currently overseeing the base's newest and most expensive upgrade package. Hunter returned to the group with practiced calm, suggesting smoothly that Mason was simply trying to distract everyone from his own lack of competence. Mason ignored the accusation entirely and requested a manual check of the auxiliary memory inside the deep control module, an area few people in the hangar fully understood. Logan warned that such a check would take at least 6 full hours to complete using standard procedure. Mason replied that they had less than 3 hours remaining before the demonstration began, which meant the process would need to happen by hand instead. Samuel, after a long pause, allowed Mason to step past the safety line for the first time, though he placed 2 officers nearby to watch his every movement closely. That moment marked a quiet turning point inside the hangar, the man once dismissed as an outsider now standing directly beside the most secretive aircraft on the entire base. Mason pulled on a pair of gloves and opened an access panel with movements so precise that several engineers nearby fell silent just watching him work. It quickly became clear that he understood every locking mechanism, every layer of insulation, and every step of the disassembly process better than most of the people who had built the current systems. Amelia stayed close, recording each finding carefully as Mason called it out, her earlier suspicion now replaced entirely by quiet respect. Deep inside the pressure feedback line, Mason discovered a small intermediary chip that had clearly been added after the original assembly. The chip itself did not destroy anything directly. Instead, it quietly distorted the system's reading of internal pressure, tricking the aircraft into believing a fault existed where none actually did, which then triggered the automatic lockdown sequence every single time. Samuel's anger flared immediately, recognizing this for exactly what it was, direct and deliberate sabotage planted somewhere inside his own base. Hunter attempted weakly to suggest that the chip might simply be a standard-approved component, nothing more than routine hardware. Mason pointed out that its serial number had been deliberately worn away, and that the adhesive holding it in place had not even fully cured, meaning it had been installed recently and quietly. Amelia pulled the hangar's security footage and discovered, with rising frustration, that the recording between 2 o'clock and 2:20 in the morning had been completely erased from the system. Mason observed quietly that whoever had done this clearly understood the base's procedures in detail, yet did not fully understand the original blueprint hidden beneath the current design. As he turned the small chip over carefully in his gloved fingers, he noticed something that made him pause, a tiny etched mark barely visible along its edge. It matched, almost exactly, a mark he remembered from long ago, one connected to a failure investigated years earlier inside the Shadow Wing program. For a brief moment, the noise of the hangar faded around him entirely, replaced by a memory he had spent years trying not to revisit. The story now turned briefly toward the past, pieced together through Joseph's confirmation over the secure line and a handful of quiet memories that surfaced through Mason himself. Years earlier, Mason had been one of the most promising young engineers inside the Shadow Wing program, a man trusted with problems that few others were even allowed to see. During that time, he discovered that a group of contractors had quietly concealed a flaw inside a pressure balancing system, choosing speed and profit over safety in order to secure a lucrative contract on schedule. Mason reported the issue immediately through every proper reporting route available to him, certain that the truth would matter more than convenience. Instead, his report was buried by people with far more influence than he had, and the warning he raised was simply ignored. During a live test flight not long after, that exact flaw very nearly killed the pilot at the controls, the aircraft pitching violently out of control in midair. Mason, working from the ground support team, broke protocol entirely and intervened directly, managing just long enough to bring the aircraft down safely. Rather than being honored for saving a life, he was blamed instead for violating procedure, an inconvenient hero in a story that powerful people needed to remain quiet. To protect the program's reputation and avoid a damaging scandal, his personal file was sealed away entirely, as though his service had never truly happened. He lost his career, his reputation within the only world he had ever known, and walked away from the military in complete silence. Mason chose not to fight the decision, not because he lacked the strength to do so, but because his wife was gravely ill at the time, and he chose to be present for her instead of waging a war against an institution larger than himself. After she passed away, he settled quietly into a simple life, repairing machines for a modest living while raising his daughter alone, far from the world that had once defined him. The story touched only briefly on his role as a father, never lingering long enough to place a child directly inside the danger of the unfolding events. Back in the present moment, Samuel slowly began to recognize the full weight of his earlier mistake, the certainty that had once felt so solid now crumbling beneath him. Samuel had heard fragments of the Shadow Wing story before, but only the official version, the one describing a single engineer who had recklessly broken procedure out of arrogance. Now he understood that the real story may have been the opposite entirely, a good man sacrificed quietly to protect the comfortable lives of people far above him. Amelia connected the etched mark on the sabotage chip back to a contracting company once tied directly to the original Shadow Wing failure. That same company, after changing its name and rebranding itself entirely, now operated as part of the network controlled by Hunter Blake. Logan's stomach turned cold as he realized that several of the approval signatures on the current upgrade components carried his own name attached to them. Logan admitted, quietly and without his usual bravado, that he had signed off on those components simply because he trusted the contractor's paperwork, never bothering to dig deeper since Hunter's reputation seemed solid at the time. Mason did not attack him for the admission, choosing instead to offer a simple observation that the greatest failure an engineer can make is trusting authority more than trusting verified data. The words landed quietly but firmly, settling over Logan in a way that felt more like a lesson than an insult. Before anyone could process the moment fully, a sharp new alarm tore through the hangar without warning. The XA-7 had just triggered its own dangerous startup sequence, with no one inside that room having given the command. Without any command from a single person inside that hangar, the X-47 suddenly shifted into a semi-automatic startup sequence on its own, lights flashing rapidly across its control panel. The overhead hangar lighting flooded red, sirens tearing through the space as soldiers scrambled to understand what was happening. If the control core continued heating under these faulty conditions, the entire system risked catching fire, threatening to destroy the prototype and endanger everyone still standing nearby. Samuel immediately ordered a partial evacuation, pulling unnecessary personnel back toward the hangar entrance while the core team remained in place. Mason warned urgently that cutting power abruptly was no longer safe, since the sabotage chip had quietly transformed the standard shutdown path into a hidden trap waiting to be triggered. Logan, panicking under the pressure, suggested falling back immediately on the standard emergency procedure outlined in their training manuals. Mason firmly disagreed, explaining that procedure had been written for a later version of the aircraft, one that did not match the deeper architecture of this particular control core. Samuel found himself caught between trusting an official manual or trusting the very man he had humiliated only an hour earlier, a decision that carried enormous weight in the seconds available to him. Amelia spoke up firmly in Mason's defense, pointing out that every piece of live data unfolding in front of them matched exactly what he had been warning about all along. Samuel made his decision quickly, granting Mason temporary technical command over the entire hangar for the next 30 minutes. It was a moment of honor partially restored, the man once forbidden from even approaching the aircraft now directing the very people who had mocked him only hours before. Mason moved fast, assigning roles with calm precision, Amelia locking down external access, Logan monitoring pressure readings, a team of engineers disconnecting auxiliary supply lines, and soldiers maintaining a clear perimeter around the danger zone. The same people who had laughed at him earlier that night now followed his instructions without hesitation or complaint. Mason crawled beneath the aircraft into a tight space where the heat was already rising steadily, working with focused, deliberate movements despite the growing discomfort. There, he discovered that the sabotage chip was not only distorting pressure data, but had also begun sending a false signal directly toward the auxiliary fuel module. If that signal was not interrupted within roughly 8 minutes, the system would begin releasing fuel directly into the test chamber, creating a danger far greater than anything they had dealt with so far. Hunter watched the countdown nearby with an unsettling stillness, almost as though he were waiting for something specific to happen rather than fearing the outcome at all. Amelia noticed his strange composure and quietly suspected that he was deliberately trying to delay any real investigation into what was unfolding. Mason called out for a specific older tool, one no longer used in modern maintenance procedures across the base. Logan admitted they had nothing like that available anywhere in the current toolkits. Mason reached into his own personal tool bag without hesitation and pulled out exactly that tool, a worn instrument he had carried with him since his earliest days inside the Shadow Wing program. The metal was scratched and aged, yet it fit perfectly into his hand, as though time itself had simply been waiting for this exact moment to use it again. He moved beneath the aircraft once more, working quickly against the rising heat, every second now measured carefully against the danger building above him. The hangar around him fell into a tense, breathless silence, broken only by the low mechanical hum of the failing systems overhead. Then, with a sharp motion, Mason severed the first signal wire, and the entire aircraft shuddered violently, the whole hangar holding its breath together as one. After Mason cut the first signal wire, the aircraft's internal temperature dropped slightly, though the danger had not fully passed by any measure. Amelia quickly traced a secondary control signal back to its source and discovered, with growing alarm, that it originated from a device hidden somewhere inside the contractor's designated work area. Hunter denied the discovery instantly, accusing Amelia of working together with Mason to manufacture false evidence against him. Samuel, his patience finally exhausted, ordered every exit from the hangar sealed immediately, allowing no one to leave until this matter was fully resolved. Hunter's composure shifted suddenly, and he stated bluntly that if the demonstration failed today, the base would have no choice but to sign a replacement contract with his own company instead. He stopped short of a full confession, but the statement alone revealed more than enough about his true motive for everyone present to understand. Hunter activated a backup device hidden on his person, forcing the X-47's systems into an even deeper level of lockdown than before. An old layer of code suddenly appeared across the main display screen, unfamiliar to almost everyone gathered in that hangar. Joseph, listening through the secure line, recognized the pattern immediately as a protocol once used long ago inside the Shadow Wing program itself. Mason understood instantly what was happening, realizing that Hunter had reached back into technology everyone believed had been buried for good. Mason explained that he had once personally written a patch for that exact protocol, though it had never been formally recognized or implemented at the time. Samuel asked directly whether Mason was capable of unlocking the system now, under these dangerous conditions. Mason answered that he could, but only by accessing the system directly from inside the technical compartment, an extremely dangerous space given how hot the core had already become. Logan suggested sending in a robotic unit instead, hoping to avoid risking a human life unnecessarily. Mason explained that a robot would move too slowly and would never be able to feel the subtle mechanical vibration running through the access line the way a human hand could. Samuel hesitated, uneasy about allowing Mason to take on this risk, reminding him quietly that he was no longer a soldier bound by duty to this base. Mason replied simply that he did not need a rank or a uniform to stop someone else from dying needlessly, a statement that settled heavily over the entire hangar. The room fell silent at those words, the weight of them landing far beyond their length. Amelia worked quickly to isolate Hunter's signal completely, cutting off his ability to interfere any further with the unfolding crisis. Soldiers moved in and restrained Hunter immediately, though he laughed quietly, confident that his trap was already fully in motion regardless of being caught. Mason climbed into the narrow technical compartment beneath the aircraft, where heat, grinding metal, and flashing red light combined into something close to suffocating. He searched carefully through the tangled wiring until he located a cluster of crossed connections that matched almost perfectly, the same configuration responsible for the old accident from years before. For a brief moment, time seemed to fold backward around him, the past and present blending together inside that cramped, burning space. He understood with sudden clarity that cutting the wrong wire here would not simply fail to fix the problem, it would trigger a complete erasure of every piece of core data stored inside the aircraft. That realization meant something far larger than the immediate danger, because it meant every shred of evidence against Hunter could vanish in an instant if he made even one wrong move. Mason now faced a decision far more difficult than any wiring problem, forced to choose between saving the aircraft as quickly as possible or preserving the evidence needed to prove Hunter's sabotage beyond doubt. If he simply destroyed the entire compromised module to stop the danger fastest, every trace of proof against Hunter would disappear along with it. If he chose instead to preserve that evidence, the process would take longer and place him in far greater personal danger inside the overheating compartment. Samuel, prioritizing human safety above all else, ordered Mason to destroy the module immediately rather than risk anyone's life over preserving data. Mason did not obey right away, understanding deeply that if this particular truth was buried once again, it would only resurface later and threaten someone else's life down the road. He said quietly, almost to himself, that mistakes buried once tend to return and kill again, a sentiment that captured the emotional center of everything he had lived through since leaving the shadowing program. His phone buzzed again inside his jacket, Lisa's name appearing briefly on the screen before fading back to darkness. He glanced at it for only a moment, choosing not to answer, then drew in a slow, steadying breath before returning his full attention to the task ahead. The detail reminded everyone watching that Mason was not some invulnerable figure untouched by fear, but simply a man with a reason to want to come home safely tonight. Amelia caught the brief exchange and understood, more clearly than ever, the quiet sacrifice this man was making without asking for recognition. Mason instructed Amelia to copy every piece of data onto an independent storage drive before he attempted to remove the sabotage chip from its housing. Logan, for what felt like the first time all night, offered his help with genuine sincerity rather than self-interest. Mason accepted without hesitation, guiding Logan to listen for the rhythm of pressure vibration rather than relying solely on the numbers displayed across his monitor. Logan began relearning, in real time, the most basic lesson an engineer can absorb, that machines often speak honestly long before their instruments ever catch up to the truth. Hunter, still restrained nearby, laughed under his breath and reminded Mason that he had lost once before and would likely lose again. Mason did not bother responding to the taunt at all. He carefully removed the final protective layer covering the sabotage chip, using his old tool to bypass the false signal and reconnect the true feedback line underneath it. Amelia confirmed, with visible relief, that the evidence had been successfully copied and secured before any further damage could occur. A new warning flashed across the main display, announcing that only 90 seconds remained before the core would overheat completely beyond recovery. The number hung in the air like a held breath, every person in that hangar suddenly aware of exactly how little time was left. Samuel, the same man who had once forbidden Mason from touching this aircraft entirely, now turned to the entire hangar and ordered every soldier and engineer present to follow Mason's instructions without question or delay. The shift in command was total and absolute, the entire weight of the operation now resting on the decisions of a man who only hours earlier had been treated as an unwelcome intruder. Engineers who had laughed at him that night now moved with focused urgency, executing each instruction the moment it left his mouth. Soldiers held their positions exactly where he asked, watching gauges and listening for changes they would have ignored completely a few hours before. Logan kept his attention locked entirely on the pressure readings, repeating the numbers aloud the way Mason had taught him only minutes earlier. Outside the hangar, dawn continued creeping closer across the horizon, utterly indifferent to the quiet battle still unfolding within those walls. The countdown began its final descent, 90 seconds ticking away with brutal indifference to everything happening around it. Mason called out instructions in quick succession, telling Logan to hold pressure manually at a precise threshold, telling Amelia to lock the override codes from outside the system entirely, and telling Samuel to open the hangar's thermal vents to release some of the building heat. A sudden rush of cold air swept through the space, scattering loose papers across the floor, while red warning lights swept rhythmically across the surface of the jet. Mason worked entirely by hand inside the cramped compartment where a single mistimed motion could cost him the narrow window still remaining. Logan nearly buckled under the pressure, but Mason's voice reminded him sharply to focus on the real numbers in front of him rather than the fear rising inside his chest. Amelia successfully broke through the first layer of the old protective code, clearing one obstacle out of several still standing between them and safety. Joseph transmitted an old authentication sequence pulled directly from the original shadowfollowing records, hoping it might still carry enough weight to unlock the system. Mason entered the code manually, his fingers steady despite the rising heat surrounding him on every side. The system rejected the attempt immediately, since Mason's old clearance had been formally revoked years earlier and never restored. Samuel realized in that instant that the very institution he served had stripped access from the only person now capable of saving everyone inside that hangar. Acting on his own authority as base commander, Samuel restored temporary technical clearance for Mason on the spot, cutting through procedure with a decision that carried real personal risk. The screen flickered briefly, then displayed Mason Carter's name alongside a newly granted special technical authorization. Everyone present saw it clearly, an undeniable truth now lit up plainly across the screen for the entire hangar to witness. Mason removed the sabotage chip completely and reconnected the genuine feedback line running beneath it, restoring the system's true readings at last. 12 seconds remained on the countdown when a stuck auxiliary valve threatened to undo everything he had just accomplished. Mason forced the valve open by hand, using his old tool with steady, practiced pressure despite the heat scorching the air around him. In the final second, the violent shaking running through the aircraft's frame suddenly stopped completely, the silence afterward almost louder than the noise that had come before it. The warning lights shifted from red to yellow, then finally settled into a steady, reassuring shade of green. For the first time all night, the X-47 stabilized fully, its systems humming with the kind of quiet, controlled power it had always been designed to produce. No one applauded right away, the shock of the moment too heavy for immediate celebration to take hold. Samuel looked at Mason, his expression carrying both visible shame and undeniable respect in equal measure. Amelia displayed the recovered evidence across a secondary screen for everyone to see clearly, the full sabotage sequence laid bare for the first time, complete with account access, the planted chip, exact timestamps, and Hunter's clear contracting connections. Logan, standing before Samuel without defense or excuse, admitted openly that he had ignored earlier warning signs out of fear for his own position within the program. Hunter was escorted out under guard, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced now by the panicked stillness of a man who finally understood he had run out of options. Mason climbed out of the technical compartment slowly, his shirt stained with oil and his hands marked with fresh, shallow cuts. Despite everything his body had just endured, his expression remained calm and unbothered, the face of a man who had never needed anyone's approval to know exactly what he was capable of. Morning light finally broke fully across Greystone Air Base as the delegation from the Department of Defense arrived right on schedule, their vehicles rolling through the main gate as though nothing unusual had happened only hours before. News of the overnight incident remained contained within the tightest circles of base security. Yet Samuel made the decision not to hide it entirely from the visiting officials. He reported honestly that an act of sabotage had nearly destroyed the program, and that the base had only been saved through the direct intervention of a man named Mason Carter. Logan was suspended from his position as lead engineer while a formal investigation reviewed his role in the failures of the past several weeks, though the story did not turn him into a pure villain, since his decision to help in the final moments mattered too. Hunter and several associates connected to his scheme were handed over to military investigators for further questioning, their carefully built cover finally stripped away completely. Amelia was placed in charge of leading an independent verification of every system on the base ahead of future demonstrations, a responsibility she accepted with quiet determination. Mason intended to leave quietly once his portion of the official report had been signed, expecting no further attention and wanting none. Samuel intercepted him just before he reached the hangar doors, standing in front of soldiers, engineers, and officers who had all gathered nearby. In front of every one of them, Samuel offered Mason a direct and unmistakable apology. He admitted plainly that his earlier statement, insisting that no civilian would ever be allowed to touch that jet, had been wrong from the very beginning, since true honor was never measured by rank but by what a person was willing to protect when it truly mattered. Mason did not gloat, did not raise his voice, and made no attempt to draw the moment out longer than necessary. He simply replied that he had not come there seeking an apology, only hoping to prevent an old buried mistake from claiming another life the way it nearly had once before. Joseph arrived in person shortly afterward, carrying formal orders to officially reopen the long-sealed Shadowwing file. Mason's original record was restored in full, finally documenting clearly that he had once saved that earlier program rather than sabotaged it, exactly the opposite of what history had quietly claimed for years. Samuel offered Mason a position as a special technical advisor attached directly to the base, a formal return to the world that had once discarded him so easily. Mason hesitated since his life now belonged to his small repair shop, his quiet routines, and most importantly, his daughter waiting for him at home each evening. Amelia spoke up gently, suggesting that the base did not need him to become the man he once was again, only the man he already was right now, fully and honestly. Mason agreed to accept the role on a temporary basis, on one firm condition that every future technical failure would be reported with complete honesty going forward, with no one ever permitted to bury inconvenient truths again for the sake of a contract or a reputation. The demonstration finally began as scheduled, the X-47 climbing smoothly into the open morning sky on a steady, controlled engine that no longer hesitated or faltered in any way. Samuel watched alongside the rest of the base, understanding fully that this single flight represented far more than the success of one program, that it also represented honor quietly returned to a man whose name had once been deliberately erased from every record that mattered. As the jet cut cleanly through the clouds above them, Mason finally returned a missed call, telling his daughter Lisa in a few simple words that he would be home just a little later than expected tonight. There were no dramatic scenes involving his daughter at all, only that brief, gentle phone call meant to soften the edges of an otherwise hard and dangerous night. Amelia watched him from a short distance away, recognizing clearly that this was a man who never needed a medal or a title to prove his worth to anyone. Before the day ended, Samuel ordered that the new technical safety report being drafted across the base would carry an official internal designation, simply called the Carter Protocol, a quiet but permanent acknowledgement of everything that had unfolded. The man once forbidden from even approaching that jet had, in the end, become the very reason it was able to fly at all. And somewhere beneath that simple truth rested the quiet, lasting kind of justice that no apology alone could ever fully deliver.